Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to be talking about something called classification. It's a topic that comes up at Key Stage 3, 4 and 5. So I'm going to try and cover all the relevant bits. We'll look at what classification actually is, where this binomial, this two-naming system to classify organisms came from. And we'll talk about something called the Phylogenic Tree and how one is put together. So first of all, let's think about this word classification. Classification is the word we use when we are organising living organisms into groups. That's actually what classification is. It's when we organise living organisms into very particular groups. Now, usually you could classify things very, very simply just in terms of hair colour, eye colour, height, width, length. But what I'm going to really focus on in this video is how you classify organisms to essentially show their sort of evolutionary origins, or their ancestry, if you like. And what we have is this sort of grouping system. Imagine when you write your address, for example, on a letter, imagine turning your address upside down, so that essentially you're starting from big and you work your way down to small. So you start with, let's say, the UK, then you move more into the region of the UK, then you move to your street, then your actual house. So what you're doing is actually going smaller in size. Now, this system that Carl Linnaeus put together in 1735 works a bit like that. It starts big and then goes a lot smaller. So we start here with kingdom. Now the kingdom essentially represents 5 very large groups: the plant, the animal, the bacteria, fungi and protozoa groups. So they're the 5 big kingdoms that all living things belong to. So they belong in one of those 5 big groups. Then after kingdom, we have a phylum. Now each kingdom is split into more groups called phyla, or the singular is a phylum. And the animal kingdom is divided into 7 phyla. Humans are in the vertebrate phylum. All the animals in the vertebrate phylum have skeletons and a backbone and are known as vertebrates. The animals in the other 6 phyla actually don't have a backbone, and they're the invertebrates. So now we're going to go even smaller. So what we're doing now is, if we're imagining that we want to classify or group a particular organism, we're going to put it into a category based on these 7 distinct subheadings. So we'll move down from phylum and we'll go even more specific. We'll think of the class. Now, I'm going to use humans in this example. The vertebrate phylum is divided into 5 classes: amphibians, birds, fish, mammals and reptiles. So you can see what we're doing is we're starting with the large groups, the kingdoms. So we belong in the animal kingdom, we're in the vertebrate phylum, the mammal class. So we're pinpointing individual organisms. After class we have order, and that leads on to family. Then we come to what are called the genus and the species. Now Carl Linnaeus developed, as I said, in the 18th century, this binomial way to name organisms to help classify them. So I'll just write there. It's called the binomial. Now bi means 2 and nomial means names, or means name rather. So it's the 2-name system. And these are the 2 names, the genus and the species. Now the genus is kind of like the generic name. It represents, or you could think of it a bit like as a surname almost. The species is a very specific name. It represents the species to which an organism belongs. So, it's in very simplest terms, but it's almost a bit like a first name. Now, the actual genus, meaning of genus, is a group of species. And the definition of a species is a group of organisms that are capable of interbreeding, so they breed with their own kind, to produce fertile offspring, so children that could essentially go on to have children. So we have kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Let's think of an example. So we'll just reduce the size of this for a moment here. Now let's take the human. So we're going to look at this guy over on the right. Let's take the human, and we want to classify which group the human is in. So we said we're part of the animal kingdom, and then even smaller, the vertebrate phylum, and then even more detailed, the mammal class. When we get to the genus and species, what we find is that we are in the group referred to as Homo Sapiens. So our genus is the first part here, because the genus comes first. So we're in the Homo group. You might have heard of Homo erectus, so very similar organisms to humans, sort of early Neanderthal man. They're in this same genus, so we do have a sort of common ancestry there, but we have a different species name, because clearly we are different to them. So our species name is this second one, sapiens. So Homo sapiens are humans. See, it's a binomial name, two parts, Homo and sapiens, genus and species. Now, in real life, in books and on the internet, when you see these binomial names, you'll recognise them by two things. They always start with a capital letter, and I've not shown it here, but usually they're written in italic font. So that's how you can spot the genus and species of a living organism. You look for the capital letter of the genus, and the whole thing usually is in italics. Now, what I'm referring to here is what's called a natural type of classification. This classification system is based on evolutionary relationships between organisms and their ancestors. It classifies organisms into groups using shared features derived from their ancestors. This is different to the other system that we have, which is called artificial classification. We don't really learn anything about evolutionary relationships in that. The artificial way simply divides organisms according to differences that are kind of useful at the time, so size, colour, number of legs, those kind of things. They're actually described as analogue characteristics. Now, classification can be very difficult to do in certain circumstances. So it's very hard to classify particular species, if you like, if it's an asexual organism, so if it reproduces by itself. Because trying to identify a species, by definition, a species breeds with another kind to produce fertile offspring. So if you have something asexual, it might be difficult to define it as or give it a species name. Equally, a hybrid is a cross between two different organisms. And hybrids are sterile, essentially. So when two different organisms mate, they produce a sterile hybrid. And it could be very difficult to classify that hybrid as one particular thing, because it may very well have traits of the two organisms, traits from both groups. Okay, so let's think about something called phylogeny. So again, I'll just reduce the size, because this is one key word that particularly is brought up more Key Stage 4, Key Stage 5. It's this word here. phylogeny. Now, phylogeny is the proper scientific term for the evolutionary relationships between organisms. So when we study these evolutionary relationships, what we're studying is their phylogeny. Now, the phylogeny of an organism reflects the evolutionary branch that led up to it. And these are often represented by what's called a phylogenic tree. So we often represent these using what's called the phylogenic tree. And we have the oldest species at the base and the more recent ones being at the end of the branches. So we're just going to draw a phylogenic tree just to show what this essentially could look like, and I'll explain. How it works. So let's just, for the sake of argument, we're just going to draw a very quick sketch of a phylogenic tree. We'll just put in a few names. So down at the bottom here, let's say we have a common ancestor. Then let's say over here we have turtles, lizards. Let's have this branch of snakes. This one here is birds. This one is dinosaurs. And this final branch over to the right, this represents crocodiles. So here's an example of a phylogenic tree where we have a common ancestor at the base, and you can see all the different branches coming off it. Now, the closer a branch is to another, the closer that evolutionary relationship between the two. So we can see that turtles and crocodiles, they're going in completely opposite directions. You've got turtles going up here, crocodiles up here. And they're branching off and giving rise to kind of different groups, if you like. So let's just look at the lizard. Let's just focus in on the lizard. And a typical exam question may be, which group is the closest relative of the lizard? And in this case, it would be the snake. Because what we do is we just look for a branch that's closest to the branch for the lizard. So we can say that in evolutionary terms, the snake is closely related to the lizard in the same respect that birds are closely related to dinosaurs, more so than crocodiles. But you can see all these organisms do stem from this common ancestor. And that's just how a phylogenic tree works and what one looks like. DNA analysis is something that often comes up in discussion about classification. Now, DNA analysis is used to provide information to support the construction of this phylogenic tree. What's called DNA sequencing, so looking at the base sequences, the letters that make up DNA, that's enabled scientists to become more certain of how closely related organisms are. If gene sequences are similar in two organisms, then the species are related. So we can say the more sequences they have in common, the more closely related they are. For example, you might not have guessed, but the actual closest relation to an elephant is actually a manatee. Now, you wouldn't necessarily think that those two would be related, but DNA evidence has suggested otherwise. So that's just a little bit about classification, or putting living organisms into groups. And what we've done is just discuss through kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species, this Linnaean way of classifying organisms with our binomial names, so our two-name system, allowing us to identify particular organisms. We've said what phylogeny is, so the actual evolutionary relationships between those organisms. And we've just shown very briefly what a basic phylogenic tree looks like. Just as a kind of one random last thing to make a note of, all of these groups that you see at the top, each one actually is called a taxon. Each group is called a taxon. So the kingdom, the phylum, the class, each one is a taxon. And that's just one term that some sort of exam questions like to pick up on. So they sometimes refer to them as taxons, so it's just worth knowing. Okay, so I hope all that helps.